can't tell you how incredible it is for me to see all of your faces in the audience. I can only imagine what it is like for Dick. Dick walked in the back entrance, looked at me, and he said, "Holy shit." I'm gonna start off this grand round, so I think this is gonna be historic. I'm gonna do it with a Hebraic invocation, which is Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam she'ehyanu v'kimanu v'hiyanu l'zman hazeh, which basically means, damn, I can't believe that we have made it this far, to this time, to this place together. I'm going to segue into the films by saying that they say you can tell a lot about a man by the vehicle he drives. You can tell a lot about a man by the vehicle he drives. As you know, Dick is an avid sailor. And when I think about Dick sailing, I think of the aphorism that goes something like this: you can't sail against the wind, but you can adjust the sails. And Dick really is the quintessential sailor who was always able to harness the prevailing winds to tack his way to where he wanted to go. So that's the sailboat. But Dick's not the kind of guy who doesn't like to sail against the winds. He likes to sail against the winds because sometimes life calls for a more direct, in-your-face approach to tackling problems. And that's where the motorcycle comes in. You know, the biker with the moral compass. So how does Dick use the motorcycle? Head down, throttle on high, full speed ahead, often against all odds. But always to do the right thing and to go to the right place. And that's what this film is about.
I don't think I've met a more passionate, socially committed physician in my entire career.
He always was and really stood by those that needed protection.
He has a true compass, and he just has a very good moral sense, a strong feeling of what's right and wrong.
Talking about moral obligation, take care of the fellow sufferer. He would do his part, and he would hold everybody else to do their part.
He has been the conscience of San Francisco General Hospital.
Dick's role was to remind the administration, to remind the other doctors, but mainly the administration, that we needed to do these things, that this was actually part of our mission, and let's go do it. Let's figure out a way.
He's feisty, and he's an agent of change, and so those things always emanate from him.
Being a leader within a group of academic physicians is a little bit like trying to herd cats, but Dick was one of the few people who had broad appeal and credibility.
Dick, both in his carriage and in his didactic incarnations, he taught us early and often that we need to respect other people and you need to honor their contributions to patients' care.
He liked to have fun and shock people. He was also very businesslike. I mean, he knew what he was doing. And he was concerned about patients more than anything.
Dick was the people's doc. He taught us how to go up against what we thought wasn't working well and wasn't right.
In a field like medicine where so much of it is about some individual who's trying to demonstrate how important they are for our field, Dick was always about, he wanted to do his best, he was always doing his best, but he saw it as part of a group activity, and the strength came from that.
Dick is such a brave, irreverent, rabble-rousing, productive, creative, and innovative person. So there will be lots of stories about his antics, his politics, his leadership, and his extraordinary legacy at San Francisco General Hospital.
If there was an issue that required communal action, that required advocacy, that required aligning with other factions that were not just physicians, we just turned to Dick. I mean, Dick was the guy.
Goal in my own clinical care to be more like Dick and less afraid to say what I think and less afraid to make the connection between social issues and the medicine that we see. I've never known why Dick or how Dick became Dick. But I've never understood really how he became who he is.
We lived in a very small house, and with 1.5 bathrooms and 2 bedrooms, and we grew up together, always in the same room, separated only by a nightstand. And he always wanted to be a doctor. I was always very envious of that. That whenever we would talk, it was always, he knew what he wanted to do, and all I wanted to do was, play baseball for the Cincinnati Reds. When someone like myself was out playing sports, he was playing with his chemistry set.
He was very sick when he was 5 years old. He was the first child to receive penicillin in Cincinnati. And sometimes when people are ill, when they're little, it makes a huge impression.
He even saved my life once. It's another example of what a stand-up guy he was. We were in Florida as young kids. We were way out, where you could walk almost a half a mile out and the water was only up to your knees, and all of a sudden an undertow came in. And the lifeguards started blowing whistles, and I saw our parents standing up on the beach. And we tried to make it back, and I couldn't make it back. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're fighting the water, and within a couple minutes, you've expended all your energy. He stayed there with me, and just wouldn't let me go, and was screaming at me and swinging at me, keeping me there. I'll never forget it as long as I live. And he was just, very strong-willed, and never willing to quit.
If I had to pick a really pivotal moment in his life, it would be when he lost his father.
In our younger years, we both were dominated by our father, and it was a very loving relationship. But our father, unfortunately, had a heart attack at 39, and then another one at 42, and he died at 47.
So there's Dick with a younger brother. Dick was 15, Jerry was 13, alone with their mother.
And he always had a really strong relationship with his mother, and so he was always really involved in being around his family and taking care of his mom. And I think that kind of spurred his interest in taking care of people, and also civil rights and social justice work.
The moment our father died, I walked, and he stayed. And that's just Richard.
But I know Dick since 1962. I first met him in the spring of 1962 when I was a freshman at Cornell, and he was a senior. The way I met Dick, I guess not very many people know that Cornell is a hotbed of fraternity and sorority life. There are more fraternities and sororities at Cornell than at any other school in the country, even though it's a relatively small school. I was going to be an exception. I wasn't going to do that. I wasn't interested. I thought it was all about parties. I wasn't going to rush, as they called it. But I had a dorm counselor who had some relationship with the people at a fraternity called ZBT. And he said, they're different. They're not just jocks and party goers, they're good people. You'll be interested, go there. So I said, all right, I'll go to ZBT, I'll meet the people there, I'll see what I think. And apparently he put in some word at ZBT, because when I walked in the door, I was immediately ushered to the fraternity president, who happened to be Dick Fine. He was the senior, president of the house, and he sat me down. And we started talking. We probably spent an hour together, half of it talking about T.S. Eliot. I was an English major, someone had told him that. And I was smitten, I thought, hey, this is different. This isn't just a fraternity. These guys are, serious people. And I joined the fraternity to move in the following fall, and never laid eyes on Dick again. I did not see him before he graduated and finished his tenure as a president. I didn't know he'd gone to medical school. I had no idea where or what had become of him. But in 1969, in June, I took a job working for the National Lawyers Guild, which is a lefty organization, very much pro-civil rights, anti-war. And as part of my job, we worked with the Panthers. And the Panthers, in July of 1969, organized a conference called the United Front Against Fascism.
The three-day conference will end with tomorrow's session, most of which will take place at newly named Bobby Hutton Memorial Park, located in the heart of Oakland's Black Ghetto.
It was in the Oakland Auditorium in July, the same weekend that the Apollo mission landed on the moon.
Okay, I'm on the top step. It's a very simple matter.
Walking around, I look and I see this guy who is wearing a flowing red dashiki, long curly ringlets of hair. And I look and I see this face and I stare at it and I say, Dick? It's Dick Fine, who had now become a doctor, which I didn't know, and not not that, because I wouldn't have run into him likely if he were just a doctor, but he was very, very politically active. And as I was providing legal services to the Panthers, he was helping medically.
See, it's no in between. You're either free or you're a slave. There's no such thing as second-class citizenship.
In the late 60s and early 70s, people were in motion. Groups of people were getting together and trying to figure out what they could do to change society. And almost every week there was a demonstration or gathering. There were grassroots organizations in virtually every profession or job category, job group. Doctors getting politically involved was unusual.
Dick both believed in social justice, and his life and all of his actions as a physician were guided by a sense and a mission of social justice.
There aren't that many doctor activists. There's a lot of doctor pacifists. There's a lot of doctors generously give of their time to help the most disadvantaged, the most needy, but they don't tend to be advocates and activists.
And later on in other parts of my life, I remember going to different family gatherings or barbecues with people.
We were at a party recently and David Hilliard was there.
Peace on an international level to put an end to U.S. imperialism.
And David Hilliard, who was the secretary for the Black Panther parties, made this big speech and came up to my sister and I, and he was like, you know, your dad saved my life.
I don't know what the backstory is to that, but a lot of it was just he took care of people when they were sick.
And that always just really stuck with me. But he really was saving people's lives. And he was doing this outside of his job as a physician. I mean, this is really something that he got involved in because he believed in it.
He understood the political process and its importance in terms of trying to bring about change.
Want war, let there be war. This is what we're saying, is that clear?
He organized something called the Black Man's Free Clinic. In those days when the Black Panthers were active in the Bay Area, they were part of that patient population. So he would recruit other members of the faculty to volunteer in that clinic, and I volunteered in that clinic, a number of times.
He was going to find people who could in fact make a difference in these people's lives. And that's such an important lesson for people who are trying to bring about change.
But if anything would rile him up, it would be what he perceived to be injustice being done, which I had tremendous respect for.
It was a dangerous time to be a black militant in this country. It was dangerous legally because you could get arrested on trumped-up charges or exaggerated charges or non-existent charges. But it was also a dangerous time physically. I mean, people would get beaten up, and there were, violent attempts against the Panthers. In December of 1969, Chicago police assassinated Fred Hampton. There's no question that that's what they did. 4 days later, the LA police attacked the Black Panther headquarters in Los Angeles, peppered the building with gunshots. And there were many reasons why black militants and members of the Black Panther Party needed both legal and medical attention.
The war of nerves between the Black Panthers and the Oakland police came to a climax. On April 6, 1968, a shootout erupted in which Eldridge Cleaver was wounded.
He would get calls in the middle of the night, and it would often be from someone within the Black Panthers, and he was really in this unique position as a doctor that he would serve a lot of people that didn't have any money, but that had good politics. And he would be their doctor, and they trusted him because they knew that he had the same politics as they did. And they knew that he was also a really skilled physician.
There were times when people went to Dick, Panthers went to Dick at 2 or 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning with bullets in them.
When someone's shot and they go to an emergency room, the police get notified. But if somebody's shot and they go to a house in Bernal Heights and knock on the door and Dick gathers his doctor bag and they take Dick away in a car.
He'd be blindfolded and he'd leave with like his little medical bag and get into a car with a bunch of people and go to some undisclosed location, which he didn't know about for his own safety or for other people's safety.
Dick was a person where actions speak loudest, talk is cheap, actions speak louder than words. That typifies Dick Fine to me.
That was the same with any kind of protests that were happening in Berkeley around the Vietnam War. Was that he was really involved in going into ambulances or making sure that when people were, beaten up by the cops, that they had medical care and that they were well taken care of. And it didn't matter if they, slept under the freeway or if they were a CEO of a company. For him, it was always about equity, and it still is to this day. That's really, he practices what he preaches.
There was a whole lore around him, and you never really knew how much of it was true and how much of it was lore, but it didn't really matter. There were discussions about Janis Joplin.
I laid on the table for 45 minutes before they looked at me, all right? The guy came in, he looks at me, 30, 45 minutes, feeled me on me, he says, you have a torn muscle.
We went to see a play with him, a musical remake based on the book
called Love, Janis, which is how Janis Joplin always ended her letters back to her family back in Texas. And there was one part of the play where they're interviewing Janis Joplin about her health. And she's like, yeah, I haven't been doing very well. Why is that? Well, I've been drinking a lot. Oh yeah, and you think that's bad for your health? And she said, yeah, my doctor tells me it's really bad for my health, and he really cares a lot about me, and so he told me I should stop drinking. And then the guy said, well, what did you do? She said, I fired him. And then looked over Dick, and Dick was just sobbing, and I said, Dick, you're right. He's like, I was her doctor. I was the one who was trying to help her see how her drinking was hurting her.
I went in the ambulance, big ambulance came in.
and then talk about the stories with her, and that she would come in after being out with the Hells Angels and just come in really bad shape after bad things happening.
And so just that combination of being so tuned in to what was happening with these major events like Janis Joplin and still to see the human in that, and to be able to bring that tenderness and be able to hold that person, that group as humans, it's really, he's been an incredible teacher and mentor for me because of that.
Well, Dick was a character at San Francisco General. Everybody knew him. He was different than anybody else. He was a different person. He represented the people. He was connected to the people. For instance, when rounds were made, Dick wanted us to include where does the patient live, does he have a place to sleep? That was not what other people wanted. They wanted to talk about biochemistry and the latest enzyme that's just been discovered, not about practical things. They were more and more agitated, and after a while, they called for a strike.
The issues were better patient care, etc., the usual things that are honorable, not just pay. Faculty were not involved, but faculty were supportive.
Being responsible for and to the patients, I felt like that we really needed to maintain that allegiance. At the same time, we supported the strike and the causes related to the strike.
He was a very significant force in getting other doctors to participate and other doctors to step up and other doctors to make their voices heard.
Most physicians feel that they're working very hard. They think that they're just helping to take care of patients was enough. And Dick was someone who felt that was not enough.
They got almost no money, but they were not striking about money. Their hours were very long, but they were not striking about that. They were striking about what they thought was insufficient services to patients, particularly social services.
He wasn't about the short-term fix. He struggled often to better understand what the determinants of that longer-term fix would require.
The residents were social activists, and knowing Dick, I know he was one of the leaders.
I don't think there's been a stronger advocate for good patient care. Not everybody actually gets down in the trenches and makes things happen.
Scientists at the National Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta today released the results of a study which shows that the lifestyle of some male homosexuals has triggered an epidemic of a rare form of cancer.
We always felt that we're in the front lines of infectious disease. Among them, it was our job to take care of AIDS. So we never questioned why does AIDS have to come here.
Both suffer from a mysterious, newly discovered disease, which affects mostly homosexual men.
He was one of the organizers for the first group that ever marched for the first gay pride parade. They would protect the protesters. And this was obviously a time, fortunately, our culture has shifted significantly around this issue.
When I came to San Francisco General Hospital, 1985, it was really very early days of the HIV epidemic. We were just beginning to even have a name for this horrible disease.
We did our residency training during the peak of the HIV epidemic when there was no good treatment. And people would come into the hospital, basically young men the same age as you and I, coming in and dying.
The condition severely weakens the body's ability to fight disease. Researchers know of 413 people who have contracted the condition in the past year. 1/3 have died and none have been cured.
And they'd come up to you and said, "Are you a doctor?" "Yes." "Doctor, can I shake your hand?" And there was testing. You're there to help them, but are you willing to shake their hand? And a lot of that went on.
We started double gloving and putting on plastic aprons. There was still this issue, well, there's no evidence that the disease is transmittable by body fluids. I may not be an epidemiologist, but I'm also not a schmuck, and I don't plan to be the index case if I can avoid it, so I'm going to take precautions.
There's a lot of panic being spread. Nobody has come down with AIDS from breathing the air. That's number one. Nobody has come down with AIDS who's been a hospital worker.
Dick was very involved in editing our policy, and then the shit hit the fan in May of 1987, because at that time there was a report of 3 healthcare workers without any other risk factors who seroconverted after being exposed to blood in a variety of accidents.
We were all concerned about our personal risk, and I think the protocols were developed.
And of course, Dick at this time was now a very senior person on the medical staff, and he was very involved on the executive committee, very involved in writing hospital policy, and again, it was all about social justice.
One of the things we were trying to do was figure out a way in which we could legally distribute needles as a way to prevent the heterosexual transmission of HIV, which, by the way, by and large, if you look at San Francisco and compare it to many other places across the country, we averted entirely by virtue of trying to figure out a way to legally buy needles and distribute them through needle exchange programs.
It is because so much blood is involved that the widespread practice of sharing needles has spread AIDS rapidly among drug users. One infected addict leaves his blood containing the virus in the needle, and the next one to use the needle gets the AIDS virus into his bloodstream.
Every week in front of the Board of Supervisors, I would go and declare a state of emergency. And under a state of emergency, a health officer has all kinds of parameters and tools that you can do. You can basically suspend all laws in order to address the emergency. And so I said, well, who can help me figure out how to socialize this notion in communities that were likely going to be outraged that the health department was putting needles into communities where there was injection drug use going on. I see Dick and I say to him, I need to talk to you about this idea. He says to me, have you talked to the faith-based leadership? And I said, the faith-based, what are you talking about? He goes, there's a whole collection of African American ministers, of which Cecil Williams is your go-to guy. I'll call and introduce you. I said, Cecil Williams, I had heard of him. He's an icon, not unlike Dick, but in different realms. Dick, more than anybody else, I think, lived both, as I said, porous to what you're trying to do in policies and care and in clinics, but really with an understanding of it's all about what's happening in the community, how it's perceived. We actually legally, health department procured needles, and under a state of emergency, we dispensed that, and we got ministers in the church to say, here's where needle exchange is happening, and it saves lives, and it, reduces hepatitis, and it reduces endocarditis, and, I had people talking about this that weren't in the medical field at all.
Hundreds of thousands of gay men and lesbian women today march for homosexual rights. Some 200,000 people marched in San Francisco. Across the nation, the parades were dedicated to victims of the deadly disease AIDS, acquired immune deficiency syndrome.
He was just someone super engaged in the process and committed to community. He was exactly the kind of person that made San Francisco, although it was not fortunate at all to have the HIV epidemic happening in San Francisco, in a sense we were very lucky to have physicians like Dick Fine around who were prepared to deal with the crisis that it was, and to be so committed and caring and to connect with the community, connect with the patients, to want there to be a clinical site that could attend to the great need that was going on at that time. Dick was running the general medical clinic. There was a tremendous range of views among different faculty here. There was a lot of fear going on, and there were some faculty who were turning away from wanting to take care of the patients out of concern that their own personal health would be at risk, or colleagues or trainees would be at risk.
And then we opened the AIDS ward. It was a whole new world because patients had to accept things which they never had before. Very often the parents didn't know that their son was gay, much less than he had AIDS, and where to deal with all of that.
Dick ensured that there was open opportunities in the general medical clinic to treat people with the infection. He was, of course, very attuned to trying to make sure we had practices in place that would make sure that everyone was safe and how they were able to deliver care and not putting themselves in harm's way, but was really someone who was articulate and a leading spokesperson at the hospital of sort of saying, this is part of the responsibility of why we have a place like San Francisco General here.
At the peak of the HIV epidemic, San Francisco General Hospital was taking care of thousands of patients with HIV, and they were primarily seen in the AIDS clinic. Dick very early on realized that there was a subset of people who essentially refused to receive care in an AIDS clinic, did not want to be in a waiting room with other AIDS patients. They did not want their families and friends to know that they had AIDS. So Dick felt it was extremely important that we create an alternative for HIV-positive patients at San Francisco General Hospital. And that's a really uniquely Dick story, finding a need and meeting that need where others wouldn't have even have seen it. Dick was always able to make visible what was invisible, bring to light the injustices and the marginalization of many of our patients.
Dick's motorcycle, I had really never spent much time on a motorcycle at all, so it was a real leap of faith for me to get on the back of that cycle.
You know, I really wish I could have seen Dick when he left San Francisco General Hospital to go to San Francisco State to take medical supplies to the students during their strike there. He would take off on his motorcycle and he'd have this white cape flowing behind him with a red cross on it, daring the police to stop him, and he was successful. He got through.
One day he offered me a ride home to my flat at 23rd and Guerrero on his motorcycle. And then the next thing you know, we were dating.
How many other attendings would ride up on the motorcycle with a black leather jacket?
I saw this man come roaring up to the hospital on a motorcycle, and I thought to myself, who is this guy?
It was really late one night, and we were at Bob Brody's house for a journal club, and I needed to get back to the hospital. And he offered to give me a ride. I didn't have a motorcycle helmet, but Peter Lindenauer had a bicycle helmet. So I donned the bicycle helmet, and Dick threw me on the back of his motorcycle, and we just careened to the streets of San Francisco. I mean, such a graceful motorcycle captain he was.
All of us have the vision of him riding that motorcycle and riding off into the sunset.
Our first date was a motorcycle ride to Washington Square Park, and we saw the San Francisco Mime Troupe put on The Curse of the Dragon Lady, which was about Madame Nu in the Vietnam War. And he brought the food. He brought hummus, pita, and salad, and a bottle of wine. He was and is just a really good defensive cycle driver. I mean, he just knew his stuff, you could tell. He has had accidents, and he had had an accident even before we met.
Over the mountain.
I got a call one day from, pretty sure it was from Talmadge King, who basically said, hey, you have to do us a favor. Dick's finally did it. He crashed his motorcycle. He's down on the 4th floor, and do you mind going down, talking to the surgical residents, and making sure that they're taking good care of Dick? I was like, race down to the 4th floor. There he is, like tubes everywhere, like he bruises, blood, stitches, broken bones, sitting there basically kibitzing with the nurses and the surgical residents, having them like wrapped up in like hysterically laughing while he's actually telling them exactly what they should do. Like he's giving them instructions, like I need more of this medicine, less of this, adjust this way, adjust this way. At that point I realized I wasn't really needed, and I sat down and joined the Dick party.
Typically he would drive my sister and I to school on the motorcycle, and there would be one of us in the front and one of us in the back. And my sister and I would always fight over who got to be in the front seat, because if you were in the front seat then you got to do the gears. And so you'd put us in the front and he'd be like, okay, rev it, and you'd kind of hear him yelling in your helmet behind you. He'd be like, okay, rev it, and you'd go up the hill. And I thought it was really normal to go to school on a motorcycle. 6-year-old and driving the motorcycle to school, I thought that was normal.
As impassioned a person as he is, as caring a doctor as he is, as effective an advocate as he is, what always struck me more about Dick was how much he cared about quality of life outside of the hospital. How much he valued his time with his family, with his friends, how much he valued having fun in life. Even if you were working hard at San Francisco General Hospital with Dick, you were always having fun doing it. And that value that he places on enjoying what you do, being passionate about what you do, and also valuing the time outside of work worked so well for Dick in such a seamless way. And it really helped me in my career as I was struggling with tension between work and family. He's been inspiring for so many people in so many ways. It's because of the ways in which he was able to marry his passion for work with his passion for life.
Well, there was a lot of things going on about new hospital, new building, new this, new that. So one of the things that was decided that we would have a clinic. It was not connected to any new building, because the first clinic was in the old building, now building 9.
And they were basically creating general medical clinic at that point. A few years before that, there was no outpatient department. There was no such thing. If somebody had surgery or was in the hospital for something, they just came back to the ward and got checked out afterwards.
And this was crazy because we got lots of patients, hospitals full, but we didn't see them between hospitalizations.
Either single-handedly or was a leader in the movement to develop an ambulatory practice at San Francisco General Hospital. That before that, there really weren't clinics, so you'd like hospitalize a patient with diabetic ketoacidosis, and then you'd like wave goodbye and you'd see them again in the emergency room or see them in the morgue.
When I started as an intern, you called an attending if you were having a problem in clinic.
It was difficult in that patients who needed follow-up, who needed ongoing care for something for which they were hospitalized, often didn't get that care.
You would take care of patients in the hospital and they would be discharged to wherever they went.
That's no way to practice medicine. So clinic was essential for us.
He realized that this was really home and this was really where he wanted to be. He came back and there was this task that needed doing of starting an outpatient department. And this was home for him, and that's really what it has been. I mean, literally, the back of our house is a wall of glass, and half of our view is San Francisco General Hospital. It's just always in his thoughts.
We really wanted to try and be the continual entity in our patients' lives.
His advocacy for primary care, I mean, that's like, feels like less of a radical thing now, but it only feels less radical now because of what Dick and his colleagues did, was to assert the role in this centrality of being sort of a doctor for an individual as opposed to for a body part.
The revamping of primary care, which was the result of Dick Fine, was what made this clinic amazing.
One of the remarkable things about Dick Fine was his ability to see the importance of and role that outpatient care for non-communicable diseases, hypertension, diabetes, and coronary artery disease. He saw the importance of that for the community at a very early stage.
The clinic system has enabled us to be much more efficient in the way we manage patients and much more sort of patient-centered in our management.
A pivot that occurred in medicine in the United States from hospital-based, kind of top-down driven doctor-patient relationships to participatory role, having healthcare be available to the masses. Dick very much characterized that narrative within the faculty's discussions and saw earlier than most everyone in the medical school the inevitability of that progression to community-based services.
When I first came on to GMC in '83, they had just revamped primary care. We knew our patients so well that we felt like we were the ones who could better advocate for our patients. And that was Dick promoting that doctor-nurse-patient relationship, that we were the triad for taking care of our patients.
Dick had a major role in creating general internal medicine and ambulatory care and continuity of care for patients. He helped change how people view American medicine and care. He wanted others to realize that we needed to improve the continuity of care and that we should actually be there for patients in a more structured way. Dick committed his life and his career to making sure there wasn't always someone different. He was there.
He started teams before there were team teaching and team rounds, incorporating the nurses and the residents and the physicians into a team.
Really what the testament to Dick is that his original conceptualization of clinic, 30 years later, 20 years later, 20, 30 years later, it's the patient-centered medical home.
He was remarkable about seeing the big picture. While he valued opportunities he had to be at the head of the table, as he was with the clinic, he always saw it as sort of like being the head of a table of, say, of a family, and he was so proud of all the activities that went on.
I interacted with Dick primarily in the general medical clinic when I was doing my internship and residency, the clinic that Dick created and the clinic in which probably 1 million visits have occurred since he created it decades ago. Dick allowed me to secretly squeeze wayward patients who didn't have a primary care doctor into my clinic panel. There was a secret back door to my clinic that Brenda, the clerk, and Terry, the nurse, and Dick, the medical director of the clinic, held open, allowing me to keep adding patients to my panel as long as the chaos remained somewhat well orchestrated and didn't create problems.
Dick Fine was an institution.
Dick is a socially committed, obviously left-wing, Jewish intellectual, and he's a figure that's larger in life. Whether he knew it or not, was actually acting out on tikkun olam, trying with every fiber of his being to make the world a better place and to right injustice. Facing up to injustice, whether it politically, socially, or medically, was what Dick Fine is all about.
You know, in pediatrics, there was a distinct time when I decided that the children needed the clinic at night more than they needed during the day. And I decided to extend the hours till 10 in the evening. That was very difficult because all the nurses said they took the clinic job because they wouldn't have to work weekends. What is this about coming in on Saturday? They refused. It was a big battle. That was my battle, but Dick was not involved.
Did you win that battle?
I won the battle.
How did you win that battle?
I won the battle by saying, if you want to work here, it'll be open Saturday. And if you don't want to work here, I'll get you a job on the ward. And then once they started working Saturday and Sunday, they realized that they can go shopping. Shops are less crowded. There are some advantages. They didn't all love it, but they accepted it. And they saw that the patients needed it.
Can I ask you a personal question about that very thing? Did it make it any easier for you to put your foot down, knowing that down the hallway was another guy, Dick Fine, who was also willing and able to stand for what was right? Do you know what I'm getting at in terms of this question of a culture of conscience?
Yes, it was easier.
Tell me about that.
Dick was way ahead of me in terms of being the conscience of and all that. He was always up front, always pounding. I was not. I took some good positions, some I just kept quiet. So Dick was ahead of me. But it was nice for me that he was pushing in the same direction and pushing harder than I was.
At the time, the crack cocaine epidemic cost the city and county of San Francisco as much as the budget deficit for the city and county of San Francisco. One of the things that I was observing in the patients that I saw was middle-aged and older women who were coming to clinic, grandchildren in tow. I remember on a summer afternoon out in the Bayview meeting this woman who was in her early 60s and her 3-year-old granddaughter, and I was just making casual conversation and said, "Oh, so your granddaughter's staying with you for the summer?" And she said, "No, I'm raising my granddaughter." Started asking more and more questions about what were the reasons behind that, and then found out in that neighborhood 1 out of 3 children was being raised by someone other than their biological parents. I met this nurse named Sue Trupin who told me about the work that she had done as a nurse in the San Francisco County Jail running support groups, and that she too was observing the same thing amongst her patients, epidemic of grandparents that were raising their grandchildren. We sat down together one day and said, you know, we really should do something about this, and Sue said, I think that a support group framework would be helpful to them, and so that's how our grandparent support group, now known as Grandparents Who Care, got started.
I went to Dick and Tricia saying, is there any way I can get a few hours of my time, which seemed pretty out there. It wasn't something that anybody had asked for really before. There wasn't a program that was demanding this.
Dick was supportive to me personally and supportive to this program by giving me the space and the time to grow the program. We had ourselves, we didn't have an office, we didn't have staff, but if it were not for him, it would not have happened.
When I was directing the inpatient service, I got a complaint about a faculty member who was dressed inappropriately. And of course, as soon as I heard the complaint, I knew who it was.
Dick had, I think maybe he had only 2 shirts, or he maybe had many of the same shirt, but they were all like, this mechanic or this bowling t-shirt with his name embroidered. It just said Dick.
He wore boots, he never wore a tie.
By the way, he wears earrings. Not only was it an earring, but it was a Mickey Mouse earring. And that was my first encounter with Dick as an intern.
My first memory of meeting Dick, I was the administrative assistant to Margaret Jordan. Dick showed up to have a meeting with her in roller skates, which was typically Dick, of course.
And I'm told by somebody in the office that this is our chief of staff. And I thought, whoa, I know I'm in a different environment where the chief of staff is wearing blue jeans.
So I went to General Medicine Clinic and I was looking around, looking for Dick Fine. And as you know, he was very casual in the way that he dressed. The initial impression was, and I remember saying to him after I found him, is like, man, all you need to do is roll a pack of cigarettes up into your t-shirt and you'll be a good old boy. And that was Dick. He was a good old boy.
Just a good old boy.
He certainly dressed, wasn't a conservative dresser, and some people, took issue with that.
The other story, I don't know if you've heard, is that previous former chief of medicine came from Cornell and said, well, we need a dress code. We need to make this place more like the East Coast. We referred him to the chair of the dress code committee, who was Dick. We never heard another word from him about that.
He was sitting in a Hawaiian shirt with his turquoise jewelry, and he had his stethoscope jammed into his top pocket and said, this is actually really important how we carry ourselves as physicians. So we talked to our patients and we asked them, how do you want your physicians to dress? And then Bob said, well, to a person, they all said, we want the male doctors to wear white coats and a tie. So I wore this today in honor of Dick and Bob. And we want all the women to wear dresses and stockings. And then Dick jumped in and said, so we never asked them again. We don't care what they want. So that was my first initial introduction to Dick Fine.
He interviewed me for this position. Right away, Dick was a character. He was dressed in the jeans and the cowboy boots and interrupted the interview so he could get tickets for Bette Midler that night. He made no secret of that. That's why he was leaving us in the lurch for 20 minutes. He went, and I remember thinking that was a okay priority for me.
As I progressed through the decades of being here, Dick was always at every single meeting. Dick was always there.
If I had to say what at the hospital Dick has changed, I think it's the feeling that this is a family.
Dick's management style, it's been much more of a fostering relationship. I left San Francisco in the late 90s. I would get 3, 4, 5 email messages a year, not just, hey kiddo, how are you doing, what's going on, but articles around things that I was interested in or cared about.
28 years ago, last month, My brother had a heart attack. And Dick was at my side through all of that. He was calling the doctors to see what was going on. He was very, very good to me.
I remember somebody saying to me that when they first came here, they thought, oh, well, this is the perfect place for Dick. You know, it's this sort of mellow, warm, you know, loving environment. And then that person realized, oh, that's because Dick made it like this, and he encouraged that.
Dick managed people and programs less through his own, you know, A goes to B goes to C logic, and more through his relationships with other people, people that many times worked for him or worked with him. For example, the fact that he empowered the nurses over so many decades just basically meant that they ran the clinic.
Dick was always an advocate for, defender of, and promoter of nurses, social workers, other people on the team. We now call them teams.
He does respect nurses. You know, that's, I think, just very clear.
If I had to fight a battle, it would be Dick Fine to be on my side, because I know that he has, his integrity is always first. Dick was always for the patients. I mean, as early on as fighting for the politics in diabetes. And I know that was a real keen thing about Dick, and maybe why he was so abrupt at times, because he knew the battle was out there, not just in the clinic, but the political nature of things, and he comes from that.
So Dick Fine actually was one of those people that really brought a meaning about the whole picture a patient to the clinic.
We all shared a common vision that things could be done differently, even though we didn't really have a clue at the time how it was going to unfold.
He really created an environment for the RNs to be autonomous. All the RNs that I know became very respected, and we were able to work up a patient on our own and present the information and be able to make a care plan on our own, obviously just bouncing it off the attending. But Dick really championed that, and I think that's why GMC has the nurses that it does, just knowing that there's attending backup, and I thank Dick for that.
Dick was such a character. He actually carried that out in his daily activities with his patients and with the staff. He wasn't covering up for anything. He wasn't trying to impress you. He was just trying to do his job, do it the best way he could.
And you always tell us how good we are. I don't feel that I'm the worker there now. I started working at the clinic March 15, 1973. And that's when I met Dr. Pine, because he's the director of the OPD clinic during those days. He was the one who mentored me, who taught me what to do in the clinic. Every Christmas we're always in touch. He always sent me this card with this newsletter that I really love reading it. He's just, I mean, he doesn't seem to be like a doctor to me. He's just like my older brother. But I'm older than I'm older, but he is a really good brother, you know.
We were encouraged to keep learning. When I trained as a nurse, even though I had a Bachelor of Science in nursing, lifelong learning as a nurse wasn't promoted. Dick brought that along. We kept reading, we circulated articles, we had lectures, we had time, paid time, to actually go to the library and research topics.
One of our activities was reading with Dick. And so he would make sure that we read outside of the medicine literature.
Encouraging that lifelong learning and that love of learning is what made nurses the best.
As far as I know, if there were any physicians in the hospital that needed a physician to check them out, they came to Dick.
This is hard to believe. In the time that we were residents, the faculty used to get free lunches and free meals, and the interns and residents who made nothing had to pay for the meals. And the way you paid for the meals is you had a meal card. And so when you went in for lunch or dinner, you stamped the meal card in the machine, and it recorded that, and then that got taken out of your salary, which was, I think, $150 or $200 a month. So one day Dick decided this was wrong, and he gathered all the meal cards together and he set them afire in the middle of the dining room. And that was the end of house staff getting charged for meals. And That was a classic, Dick Fine moment, I thought.
The reason that GMC is so different than any other clinic is because of the teamwork fostered by Dick.
When the interns would show up, he would first of all always invite them out to his house and they'd go sailing.
That very first few days before we even started residency, Dick took us all sailing.
Dick had a boat up on Tomales Bay.
It made us all feel much safer about starting internship.
He would drag the four of us up there, and we would all be sleep deprived, and we would be exhausted.
He'd engage in them in this very personal way, and so suddenly the idea of someone who is an advocate and a rebel became like, oh my God, he's such a nice guy, he's so caring.
Somehow going sailing with Dick all together, telling hilarious stories, made us all feel like somehow it was all going to be okay.
So what programs has he been involved with that have had a lasting impact here?
Tangible, right? Yes, concrete. He wants concrete.
Well, I mean, I think starting an outpatient clinic probably is number one. I think having developed the program for jail medicine, I mean, I completely forgot to mention that, but as you asked the question, I mean, I think jail medicine...
Hold on, I've got a motorcycle.
Oh.
It was Dick's motorcycle.
Yeah, right. And his daughter's driving without a head.
He started the San Francisco General inpatient psychiatric jail ward. He had a huge impact on that and on the jail health program.
What healthcare was like for prisoners in the jail was basically there was none, that the doctors were marginally competent, that they came and went, that special diets never happened, that people were dying of diabetes because they weren't eating properly, people were not getting medication that they needed.
If you were sick while you were in the jail, which happens quite often, either you were cared for by a few staff in the jail or you came to the emergency department.
Jail inmates in the hospital is that they would come in, they would go on a regular ward, they would be handcuffed to their bed, and a sheriff's deputy would have to be on duty 24/7 guarding them. I mean, people would be handcuffed to the operating table. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was crazy stuff. There were community block grants available for community clinics, and Andrea and Dick figured out that a jail's a community, so they wrote a grant called the Medical Care Project for Institutionalized Persons and got community block grants for this clinic, which was the San Francisco County Jail.
Well, I would say that Dick exhibited the conscience of the physician, of the medical staff, that it is our obligation to take care of.
He also had the ability to discern the important elements that would lead to the more sustained, durable, impactful solution.
We're sitting in the Center for Vulnerable Populations. That is an outgrowth of the kind of commitment he had.
During a time when we were just beginning to initiate Healthy San Francisco, I managed to orchestrate a meeting, happened to be on Halloween, and so me, Dick Fine, Teresa Filella, and a couple other people met with Mitch Cass downtown, and we agreed to meet out front. So we pulled up out front, I walk out, and there's Dick Fine, dressed with a black cape in purple, wearing a little headdress that had devil's horns on his head. And I said, what's with the devil outfit? And he's like, I'm gonna tell him the devil's in the details, Jeff. That's what this is about.
Back in 2003, he was very involved in bringing out folks to do buprenorphine waiver trainings. Buprenorphine had just been approved by the FDA for office-based opioid addiction. He was one of the leaders in getting people out here in San Francisco in the Department of Public Health trained. So I was in that first batch of people that got trained.
For example, his work with people with chemical dependence. So he was the person that promoted how to do opiate maintenance with dignity, which led to the OBO project.
So it was great to have that example that he set forward. The other piece around addiction is, how do you implement treatment into a setting like this? And he knew how to do that.
Dick was very passionate about providing care to people who were drug addicts, and he worked very hard to make sure that care was humane, make sure that they actually there were clinics available to help them get off of it, and he was a strong advocate for the proper way to get off your drug addiction. The methadone clinic was something that he was an advocate for.
He knew who are the people that we need to talk to so that we can have a policy so that we can use this medicine. How are we going to write this new procedure and policy so that nurse practitioners and people who weren't physicians without waivers could be involved in the treatment of office-based opiate addiction? So that's huge.
There was an episode in the clinic with one of my patients, and I had taken care of this patient for about 6 months, and it was my intern year, right? So you're always wondering if you really know what you're doing, and you're always worried about some terrible outcome. One day I was in clinic, I was post-call, a family member of my patient came into the clinic, and I was surprised to see her because it was actually the wife of my patient. And it turned out that my patient had killed himself, had hanged himself. And as an intern, that was really a terrible situation. And Dick, I went into the room and told Dick what happened. You know, Dick didn't say anything. He just came over and gave me a big hug. And I started crying, sort of like I am now. And it was just this moment where I saw an aspect of Dick that I hadn't experienced before.
First time I was involved in a really horrible error where someone died, and I was absolutely beside myself. My pager rang and it was to Dick's office, and I had this moment like, oh, now I'm gonna have to like go through this whole story, and he's gonna totally tell me all the horrible things that I did, and I just, you know, I was just really pretty devastated. And I called, and it was Dick, and he said, hey, this thing just came across my desk, this event that happened, and I'm sure I burst into tears or something. And he said, he's like, I read through all the charts, I know what happened. We can talk another time about what, you and everyone else could have done differently, but I'm actually just calling because it came across my desk and I was worried about you. What was so amazing was he didn't try to make it all go away, and he didn't try to pretend that we hadn't made mistakes. He said, you made a mistake. A lot of people made mistakes. A lot of bad things happened. You weren't the only one. This happens, and really what matters is how you go on from here, how this changes you, how you do things differently. And also what matters is that if you're going to last in this career as a physician, you can't give up just because this happened. And he was so incredibly both attentive to my emotional well-being, but also did not try to make it all go away. Really allowed me to forgive myself, I think. And so it was a very, I don't even know if he remembers that, but it was an incredibly powerful and really important moment in my medical training and development as a doctor.
And it really showed me how not only brusque and robust he is, but that he's an incredibly caring person, and that his ability to reach out to me when I needed that kind of support was just remarkable, and it's something that I'll always remember and always be grateful for.
Whether it was being Janis Joplin's doctor or a homeless person's doctor, Dick's legacy is really what he created at this hospital as a place for everyone to come to.
I don't think there's been a stronger advocate for good patient care.
I think his legacy is people like me and other people here that are going to be the next generation of people who run in the hospital that he's had an impact on.
He was a wonderful mentor to many of us who continued to work with those same elements that he defined and held us accountable for.
Dick is a pragmatist. He's very practical. There's nothing theoretical or abstract. It's all quite real and on the ground. And one of the things I loved about him is that you get what you see.
Although Dick was utterly irreverent, he followed his passion and his mission for social justice by creating institutions that will live on for many years to come.
In that regard, he was the everyman. He was the person that a lot of us had in mind. If Dick could do this, we all can do this.
He was so influential here, and why he touched so many people's lives was his authenticity. He kind of was who he was, and what you saw was what you got with Dick.
While he was an exceptional physician, an exceptional leader, and one of a kind, he just was a good manifestation of a part of all of us that he was just able to express in effective ways that many of us, weren't able to or didn't have the space to.
The only hope we have of stemming, if not reversing, the inequality that is growing in the society is people who have the benefit of privilege standing up and saying, no, this is wrong. And Dick was doing that 50 years ago.
There are certain people who serve as a moral compass in any institution. And I think that if you look back over the last 40 years, that certainly Dick Fine rises head and shoulders above everybody else as the moral compass for San Francisco General Hospital.
So how did Dick and his legacy impact me and my career and my work? If I had been asked that question a week ago before we started this film, I think I would have answered it very differently. But the making of this film has opened my eyes to so many new things about Dick and his impact that I just had never really put together in my mind. The first and foremost, I think, is that I always, having come to San Francisco General at a time when Dick had been fairly well established, I never had the luxury of seeing what this institution was like before he was here. So I always have assumed, wow, isn't it cool that Dick Fine works here and San Francisco General is this progressive place and it's this solidarity place where we're all, fighting the good fight and doing what's right, and how convenient it is that Dick works here. When in reality, I think I've learned that Dick really shaped that culture at San Francisco General Hospital. That it wasn't always, yes, we were a place that took care of the indigent, but it wasn't always a place that was, ahead of the curve in terms of progressive politics and progressive medicine and social medicine. A lot of what we think of today as the San Francisco General ethos is really just an extension of Dick.
I don't know if you want to say anything. You don't have to. Just want to say, when Dick says, I just want to say a few words. Give yourself half an hour.
It's just said slowly.
Like Bill Checker.
So, it's hard to remember. Okay, Pete. Obviously, this is incredible. It's so overwhelming. Where do you begin? And I look around this room and I see my life. And I see my life. And the people who were interviewed, the people here are people that...
Think Janis Joplin.
I'd be kicked out of the room if I thought you. Oh, Mom, you made it. Anyway, I just am phenomenally grateful, mainly for the strength that you guys, as a collective group, empower me to feel right now. And this is one of my major goals, was to be able to do this and stand up and to thank people and not give up. And hopefully we're all going to fight, because we got a lot coming, guys. It's just very powerful, and I'm extraordinarily grateful to everyone who helped build this institution and build our relationships with each other. We really are, an amazing family. Sue, both Sues, have maintained that in a very strong way. Our leadership, is incredibly gifted and helpful, and you inspire all of us. You inspire me, you inspire my family, and you're good people, and thank you very much. Time to use our collective resources as we rebuild San Francisco Gym, especially the new buildings.
Here it comes.
And gracious gifts we're getting, to thank people. Holly Smith, thank you for firing me twice.
Rehired.
Anyway, again, let's go kick some ass.
After 1 o'clock, people have got to go stamp out poverty and disease, but we have 3 things we need to do. Jamie, can you hold this for a second? Sure. So we have made a t-shirt. I think Alicia Fernandez, are you here, Alicia? Okay, so Alicia said right at the beginning of the interview, she said, I want to be more like Dick. So we made a t-shirt. This is a Dick with his specs, the mirror glasses and the flower behind his ear. And it says, I want to be like Dick. And in the back, it says, he's as real as it gets. So you can purchase this t-shirt for $25 and up, and according to Dick, the proceeds will go to the San Francisco General Hospital Foundation. So if you want to purchase one of these t-shirts and give money to the foundation, you can either email me or email my assistant, Lauren Davidson. We're in the UCSF directory and the SFGH directory, and tell us your size, and we'll work with the foundation to have a whole system in place. That was number 1. Number 2, I wanted to invite the chief of the medical service, Neil Poe, up to the podium for a special awarding moment.
So first of all, I want to give thanks to Dean for his So when I came here several years ago, one of the first physicians to come to my office here was Dick. And he came to my office and he gave me his version of the history of San Francisco. But most importantly, he told me about the culture here. And he actually even educated me about the neighborhood. He brought with him a book that had 5 murals in the mission, and explained to me why I had to go and see each and every one of them. And that's when I knew that Dick was really special. So each year, actually in 2003, we established the John Murray Award in the Department of Medicine here for excellence and dedication to the humanitarian mission of San Francisco General Hospital. And we have a committee each year that solicits nominations. I mean, we got a large number of nominations this year, but there was one nomination that really rose to the top. And I want to read you what one of the nominators said about this nominee. This physician epitomizes San Francisco General Hospital with his fierce dedication to the care of the most vulnerable populations. He is passionate and cares deeply about patients. He is an incredible advocate, teacher, and clinician, and very well deserving of the John Murray Award. He has inspired more than a generation of trainees and is the epitome of dedication and love for primary care. There's no one more deserving of this award this year. So Dick, I present you with the 2015 John Murray Award. Thank you for the contributions you've made here. Thank you for transforming the colleagues. Thank you for transforming this place. And most of all, thank you for being Dick Buck. I
want to rip off that last statement. So, John Murray, are you here, John? John couldn't make it today.
He's getting cataracts.
He's getting cataract surgery like everybody over age 75 is right now. But when I was doing my research for this documentary and looking at the archival material at the San Francisco General Hospital Library, I came across a bunch of articles about the strike. And there's an article about Dr. John Murray, who I think was chief of staff at the time, talking about this Dr. Richard Fine, who was on strike. And so the beauty of you receiving the John Murray, not the overstatement. And John would be the first to give you the award. Because subsequent articles, this is actually an important point, 2 or 3 years later, John was giving testimony to the supervisors about the conditions that the patients were sustaining at San Francisco General. So he was channeling you as he was giving that testimony. So it's great that you got the award. The last thing I wanted to do was first to invite Alice Chen down to the front and Claire Horton down to the front. The three of us are, I call us the three musketeers. We are the three followers in your footsteps as medical directors for General Medicine Clinic. Was that?
How many twins?
And yeah, a lot of twins, exactly. That's why I said I want to be like Dick. So I'm going to hand it over to Claire, who is the current medical director of the General Medicine Clinic, for a brief announcement.
So this was pretty amazing. I do have to say that when I was a resident, we made it all the way to third year, and we heard about the sailboat thing. We went to Dick and we said, "Hey Dick, what about the sailboat thing?" I said, "Oh, I'm kind of tired." And we said, "No." So that was an amazing day, and you've been an amazing inspiration. So I think as everybody saw in the film, there really wouldn't be a general medicine clinic without Dick. But I also think it's fair to say that it's been called the General Medicine Clinic for a long time. And today we'd like to rename it the Richard H. Fine People's Clinic. So I can't think of a better name and a better reminder every day as I walk through.
I haven't got 75 million.
It is the Zuckerberg People's Richard Fine.
I think it's a good kind of balancing measure. So, and thank you to Sue and to Sue also for your support.
Yeah, when we pitched the idea to the Sues about the Richard H. Fine People's Clinic, they're like, "That's great."